This is the King 95 Pro from Montech, and their packaging doesn't lie. I feel like this is the best value dual chamber case you can buy right now in early 2024. Coming in as low as £109 with 6 ARGB fans or £88 without any, I think Montech have absolutely nailed their slogan, which is quite literally the best value. That's it. That's their target, and the King 95 Pro absolutely proves that. Whether the front glass is curved or flat, it wouldn't really make a difference. The King 95 is a phenomenal case in more ways than just price, and I'll explain why. Now let's not kid ourselves. Dual chamber cases aren't exactly new, and it seems every company and their dog has one or has an upcoming one in the pipeline. They allow the user to get an extremely clean aesthetic with all that glass, but allow for great airflow options. The King 95 Pro enhances that theory and one-ups other manufacturers by including an optional mesh front panel in the box too, allowing you to hinge the side fan bracket to the front of the case to allow for a more traditional case design and layout. Then if you wish, you can add more fans to populate the side again. Something you may actually want to do because these ARGB fans are incredibly affordable. It's £7 for just a 120mm or £12 for a 140mm to buy them separately. Though you could see it another way and say that the King 95 could have been cheaper if Montech opted not to include the mesh front panel and all the tooling involved required to make it happen. So if pricing is something you really want to consider, with the Pro version you get 2 140mm fans and 4 120mm fans. 5 of these fans are reverse blade fans too, so you can see the nice side of the fan and not the ugly rear. In total that works out to be about £52 worth of fans. There's also an included ARGB PWM fan hub, which allows you to connect up to 10 devices. The King 95 Pro only costs £20 to £25 more than the base version, so I'd recommend grabbing the Pro version every time, unless you already own or want some really top quality fans. The King 95 is also available in 4 colours. The white that I have here, as well as black, red and blue. The other colours have a black interior and come equipped with the same fans but in black. Both the Pro and base versions do include the ARGB LED strip on the front of the case too, as well as the same I/O and dimensions everywhere else. Pricing is a little bit all over the place for the other colours, as I imagine red and blue cases are a little harder to sell than your standard black or whites. Now before we take a closer look at the exterior of the King 95 Pro, if you could go ahead and just do me one favour, click that subscribe button down below. You can always unsubscribe later if you decide my face truly offends you. Walking around the exterior of the King 95 Pro, you can't help but feel like this case should cost more than it does. There's so many little things that you just appreciate about Montech's design choice here. I mean, the curved glass is definitely an eye catcher, but more importantly, not just having a pillar there is far more important to me. Without the glass or mesh panel at the front, the corner where you'd expect the case to be weak, it just isn't. It's super sturdy, and just the entirety of this case is just so well built and thick and heavy in a good way. This honestly isn't what I was expecting for this price, with 6 fans included. As someone who's had an original O11D for the last 3 years or so, being able to see inside the chassis and get a better look of your components is a big plus for me. The more I see this case, the more I consider migrating my gaming PC inside this thing. Even the screws that hold all the panels together are captive, and throughout the entire build, Montech have made use of really nice looking screws, which just adds that little extra bit of panache. All of the panels are incredibly easy to remove and are all toolless, and as a little bonus, the feet are also easily removed. If you want to paint them, wrap them, or do whatever you might enjoy doing with feet, that's up to you. The rear side panel is nearly entirely mesh with some kind of slightly wavy lines that perfectly matches the aesthetic of the top panel. Now the top panel is a little bit of a sticking point for me. There's a small gap around the top of the case, I'm guessing to allow some more natural passive airflow in and out of the case, but I just can't help but feel it wasn't really needed. I'm kind of unsure whether I like it or not. One thing I definitely don't like though is that somehow my top piece looks to be slightly bent. I've no idea how this has happened. I can only assume either during shipping or maybe I've lent on it without realizing at some point. It's kind of strange as the top panel is actually really solid and sturdy all round, but just where that gap is at the edge, it doesn't really have any support and is a lot more susceptible to potential bending, I guess. Also, now that I've seen it, I just cannot unsee it. Another thing I'm not completely sold on is the material on the front panel surrounding the I/O and the power button. It seems to be some kind of textured plastic, I'm assuming potentially 3D printed. Unless you get incredibly close, you can't really see it, but you can feel it when you touch it. Speaking of the I/O, you get everything you'd expect at this sort of price point. 2 USB 3.0 Type A ports, a single USB-C, as well as a headphone and microphone jack. One really nice touch is the fact that the USB ports have a white interior. I think that looks super clean. The power button also feels good and clicky, not some horrible mushy thing you might think Montech might have tried to sneak in there to save a few pennies. There's also another button which is used for switching LED modes on the fans and the front panel LED strip. As far as dust filters are concerned, there isn't a lot to talk about. The top panel and side panel have them integrated to the steel themselves, which you either love or loathe. I'd rather it was more like the mesh for the front panel. Plenty of perforations with no filter needed, as it's just so fine. On the bottom there is a filter for the intake fans, and it is massive. It slides out from the rear of the case, which is a little bit annoying. Because it is so huge, it means you need a lot of room behind the PC to remove it. If it was a small filter for a PSU, then I get the rear removal thing, but something this large should have been able to be removed from the front. So as you strip away those glass panels, you get a better look inside at where you'll be working. As you can see, Montech continued to use the nice shiny screws for the expansion slots as well as all the fans. A real big plus in an all-white build. On the main side of the chassis, you can see we've got 6 all-white cable grommets around the perimeter of the motherboard to make things a little bit tidier. Also, they do actually stay in place when you poke cables through them. Always a bonus. The front I/O for the power switch comes in a nice neat block. I always praise companies for this, as it's just such a big deal, especially for new or irregular builders, and heck, even regular builders probably appreciate it even more. All the cables for the USB and HD audio are all white as well, except the HD audio does lose some points for still showing the ugly coloured cables once plugged in. The cables from the included fan and ARGB hub are unfortunately black, even though all of the fan cables themselves are white. So that's kind of stupid. Though if you're like me and have a cooler with black cables for the USB or the fan cable, you just kind of accept it. Now one thing that does kind of annoy me is the cable for the rear fan. It just kind of sags perfectly in the way to make fitting the motherboard a bit of an unnecessary faff. I'd like Montech to copy what NZXT did with the H5 Flow and add a tiny little clip to keep that cable out of the way. Speaking of fans included with the King 95 Pro, you do get 3 RX120 fans, the RX meaning reverse blade, 2 RX140 fans and 1 AX120 fan in the rear. So if you plan on making use of the hinge to the right hand side of the motherboard to hinge your fans to the front of the case, one thing you'll need to remember to do is to turn the 140mm fans around the other way, as they are reverse blade fans. If you hinge them to the front, they'll just be exhausting instead of intaking. Alternatively, you could just buy 2 extra AX140 fans to match them and put them at the front if you plan on using the case with the mesh at the front. Now let's quickly talk about compatibility inside the King 95 Pro. At the rear of the case, we have room for one 120mm fan. Up top we can fit 3 120 or 2 140mm fans. At the bottom we obviously have 3 120mm fans, or you can fit 2 140mm fans instead. Then on the side of the chassis or the front, you can fit 2 120 or 2 140 fans simultaneously. So as you can expect, radiator compatibility is fairly straightforward. A 240 or 280 at the front or side, then a 360 up top. Montech has no mention about being able to mount a radiator at the bottom, but I see no reason as to why you couldn't fit a 360 down there as well. If you go with an air cooler inside a case like this, which you really shouldn't do, the maximum CPU tower cooler height is 175mm. So you should be able to mount pretty much any massive tower cooler you can get your hands on. Maximum GPU clearance is up to 420mm, or a little bit less assuming you don't have a radiator and fans installed at the front. If you make use of the included bracket in the box and remove the fans at the bottom, you can fit up to 8 2.5-inch SSDs or 5 3.5-inch SSDs in total inside this chassis. Now it's time to head round to the rear of the motherboard and talk about cable management. How easy is it to build inside the King 95 Pro? Honestly, it was a piece of cake. It would have been 2 pieces of cake if I didn't use the cable extensions though. I'm not sure that's an actual phrase, but we'll roll with it. As with all dual chamber cases, you usually have a lot of room for stuffing cables and fan hubs and RGB cables if need be. But thankfully, a lot of that is taken care of with the King 95 Pro. There's an included RGB and fan hub that supports up to 10 devices, and it's tucked neatly out the way behind this hinge door. One slightly annoying thing is this hinge door does require 2 screws for you to hinge it open, but if you've stuffed a lot of bulk behind it, you might appreciate that extra security of screws. The other thing to bear in mind is that when opening and closing the door, the cables can get trapped, so they need a little bit of a poke to keep them out of the way when closing. Also, if you plan on removing this door, it is an absolute nightmare to get in and back out because of this weird hinge mechanism. It'd be great if it just kind of slid up and pulled off, you know, like glass panel hinges usually do. Around this side, you can also see we have 2 storage caddies with easy access from the back of the case. You can always remove this cage and actually fit a second power supply if you wanted. I'm not sure why you would want to, but if you have a use case, let me know in the comments section down below. I personally like these cages as they're a good contained way of stuffing some excess cables. Even with the cable extensions and adding extra bulk, there is just so much depth for you to work with. I can fit my entire hand comfortably behind the hinge door with room to spare. If they can use hands to measure horses, why can't we use hands to measure cable management? Now, cable management in terms of organization and routes to follow is a little bit dire. You only get 3 Velcro ties pre-fitted and that's about it, though you do get another 4 in the accessories pack, which is nice as you can use them to help tidy things up a little bit. But even with the enormous ATX cable extension clogging up my clean cable runs, I just didn't really need to use them. Now, I've been critical of other cases like the P20C I recently reviewed of doing basically the same thing, giving you some Velcro ties and leaving you to get on with it. The difference with the King 95 Pro is that the case will close absolutely fine if you didn't bother doing any tidying whatsoever. Compared to the P20C or the Deepcool CC560, they needed time and effort on your part. This is probably one of the big reasons a lot of people like these dual chamber cases. You just don't have to try when it comes to cable management, and case manufacturers don't need to think of some sleek, cool channels or impressive cable covers to make it look cleaner and easier to work in. There is a good amount of cable type points if you just tidy things up a bit, more near the top of the motherboard, but there's just so much empty space. It's kind of like, why bother? I've used a small amount under the PSU, I stuffed some cables inside the hard drive cages, and there's just still this big gap above the PSU as well. Again, this isn't new or specific to the King 95, but it's the first dual chamber case I've reviewed on the channel, so I just wanted to get my thoughts across regarding these things. Building in the King 95 was an absolute dream. You can just remove all the panels in seconds to have an incredible amount of room to access everything you could want. All the screws and accessories you could need come in this perfect little box with each section being individually labeled. Massive points there for Montech. If you prefer, you can remove the top bracket to screw your fans and radiators to it first for easier installation, and then once you're done cable managing, you can just close the door around the back and basically covers up 90% of the cable mess. If you opt for hinging the fans towards the front of the chassis, you will have to remove one of the 120mm fans at the bottom first. You will also need to loosen a screw at the top of the case to allow this little piece of metal with screw holes to swing down. Then you can just fix the fan bracket into place with the same thumb screws that were holding it in its original position. The main downside is that you will end up leaving a bit of empty, ugly space unless you add a further 2 fans there. And even if you do, you'll still see some of your front panel cables along the bottom, which looks a little bit untidy. Thermals are usually the most important part when it comes to a case. But let's be honest, we already know it's going to be somewhere in the middle of the road. This case is designed for looks over performance, so with that in mind, let's jump in. So in the default state out of the box, our CPU tops out at 75.8 degrees. Actually pretty good. Swapping the glass for the mesh panels sees our temps increase a little to 76.1 degrees, likely because we're just losing air out the front of the case and it's not quite making it to the CPU. So if you swing those side fans round and make sure they are intaking, not exhausting, then the temps only drop a little bit compared to the default state from 75.8 to 75.5 degrees. So a little bit pointless. If you did add another 2 140mm fans to the side, you could fill the empty void and go into turbo mesh mode, as Montech calls it. Now for the GPU tests, it's a little bit underwhelming. They're not bad, just a bit meh. In the default state, we hit 63.9 degrees. Again, swapping the glass for mesh panel and leaving the fans in their regular position sees our GPU hit 64.8 degrees. Quite a big jump actually. Though if you hinge the fans round and set them to intake, our GPU tops out at 62 degrees. So obviously, having that mesh front panel with no fans at the front is actually a big negative, and you shouldn't do it. Though, how does this case compare to the cases we've recently tested? Well, it actually tops the charts for CPU temperatures out of the box. Likely because it just has so many fans from the beginning, whereas the other cases I've tested might have only had 2 or 3. Then for GPU temperatures, it's about average, ironically performing worse than the Corsair 4000D Airflow with just 2 fans inside it. The fans in the King 95 Pro actually hit around 1750 RPM, so they're no slouch when it comes to speed, so it's a little bit annoying to see GPU temperatures as high as they were. One issue I do have with the fans, or perhaps more likely the controller, you can't adjust the RPM below 750, which is dumb and means you can't quite get these fans silent whilst idle. I haven't had any issues with any other cases I've tried to do this to, even DC fans. I usually test each case in a couple configurations and will always show in the graphs a couple options. So if you think the numbers looks a little bit too high or too low for a particular case, go ahead and watch the review of that case to see how and if I managed to improve on its default state. As always, I like to give you guys a little noise test at different fan speeds, so go ahead and take a listen to the fans included in the King 95 Pro. Now, as we've just seen, when it comes to noise and thermals, this case isn't going to break any records. The fans are fine, but not outstanding. And the added option of the mesh panel doesn't really change anything. So then you're probably wondering, why have I been so upbeat about this case? Well, it's obvious, and Montech nailed it with their slogan. It is the best value. I'm well aware you can get other dual chamber cases for cheaper than the King 95 Pro, just I guess the King 95 without any fans. But honestly, you're unlikely to get all of the premium features at this price. Is it the cheapest dual chamber case you can buy? No. Does it have the best layout for airflow? No. Is it the most premium case with endless options for inverted graphics cards or motherboards? No. But does it offer great looks, premium build, premium screws and materials, toolless panels, an easy building experience, a nicely diffused RGB lighting, a beautiful piece of curved glass? Yes. Yes, it does. Not to mention, for just £20 extra, you can get 6 ARGB fans, of which 2 are 140 and 5 of them are reverse blade, as well as that extra slab of metal for more drives and the mesh front if you prefer that look and layout. There's just so much for your money. Again, you could argue that it should be cheaper if they just got rid of the mesh panel and the tooling involved to make that thing happen, as well as the hinges for the fans and the brackets. But it's good to have options, and it's good to be able to customize and choose the way you want to build. At the end of the day, it's by no means perfect. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm sure my top panel has the slightest dent in it. It's also incredibly heavy and has a massive footprint. Not to mention, a lot of the panels have panel gaps and don't perfectly line up. But I suppose that's never stopped people buying a Tesla. Now, the most important part is, would I recommend the King 95 Pro? Absolutely. It's incredible value, incredibly well built, and it looks insane once you've got all that RGB bling going. Though it is large and you will need a big strong surface to keep it on, I'm also still a little uncertain about the curved glass being in 2 pieces, as I think the gap kind of hinders the look. The upcoming MSI Maestro 700L appears to have just one enormous piece of glass wrapping around the entire case, and that looks like it could be the ultimate dual chamber case with a curved glass panel. Though will it be as cheap as the King 95? I highly doubt it. Anyway guys, that brings us to the end of the video. What do you guys think? Is the King 95 Pro worthy of your PC components, or would you rather stick with a brand you're more familiar with, like Lee or NZXT? If you'd like me to check out any other good PC cases, please let me know in the comment section down below. And if you've enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like, and if my face hasn't offended you, don't forget to get subscribed. If you're interested in checking out the Montech King 95 Pro or any extras I may have mentioned, make sure you check the description for my affiliate links. I'll catch you in the next one, guys. Cheers.